Quickly, we'd like to take care of some housekeeping business, which is one, acknowledging staff who was involved in this year's conference planning. One of the persons I'd like to recognize is Kristen Sandvik, who serves as our Senior Program Officer for the Black United Fund. Also, John Crowley, who serves as the Director of Development and Marketing. I see one of them here present. Please acknowledge. Also, we would like to acknowledge our many sponsors. There is a listing, and we suggest that you refer to that listing in today's conference booklet. And we'd also like to thank the many sponsors who've supported us over the years. I'm very pleased to be in a position to introduce our featured speaker, Dr. J. Herman Blake, and thank you, the City Club, for allowing me that honor. We, the Black United Fund of Oregon, with Dr. Blake's permission, provided for you a biographical sketch of Dr. Blake in today's program, but permit me to duplicate and provide additional information related to his background and accomplishments. Dr. Blake's early childhood, as he remembers it, was spent in New York, where he visited with the elderly and read the Bible to them. Given that experience at an early age, it is not surprising that Dr. Blake now serves as Vice Chancellor of Undergraduate Education of Indiana University-Purdue University at Indianapolis, a professor of sociology, anthropology, education, a Eugene M. Lang visiting professor of social change at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania, served as president of Tougaloo College in Mississippi, and the founding provost of Oaks College in California. Dr. Blake earned his BA in sociology from New York University and an MA and Ph.D. degrees from the University of California at Berkeley. He also attended the Institute for Educational Management at Harvard University Graduate School of Business Administration. Dr. Blake has received fellowships from the Rockefeller Foundation, Ford, John Hay, Whitney, and Woodrow Wilson Foundations, and is listed in Who's Who in America. Considering all of the accomplishments of Dr. Blake, I would like to emphasize Dr. Blake was the president of a historical black institution where approximately 50% of his graduates go on to receive graduate and professional degrees throughout the United States, which I believe is in keeping with his goal of maintaining educational excellence. Dr. Blake has produced many educational articles, but when it comes down to education, as Dr. Blake has stated, we must keep on keeping on if we truly believe and are committed to reclaiming our children. I present to you Dr. Herman Blake.
President McWilliams and President Priestley, as well as other members of the Platform Party, it's a privilege for me to be here this afternoon. I want to thank you for the invitation to address this conference and the City Club of Portland on this very critical question of reclaiming our children. I also want to say that being in Portland has been a wonderful experience for me in another level, in that I have so many friends here. And it has just been marvelous walking into this hall from almost every part of my life. My sister, my daughter, both of whom live and work here in Portland, my sister at Emmanuel Hospital, and my daughter at the Chamber of Commerce, and then two former students from Oaks College, Cynthia Geyer and Miriam Ostrow, and then two graduates of Tougaloo College. It seems like your whole life is coming back before you. And I particularly wear a tie which reflects my own commitment to children and my work with children, and particularly through an organization that I got involved with as a result of Cynthia Geyer's intervention, Save the Children. All of this reflects my own belief and conviction that if we don't do a far better job of preparing our children for the future, we will not have a future. I never begin any presentation, and there isn't enough time to share with you all of the ideas I wanted to articulate this afternoon, because I feel kind of bifurcated talking to the City Club of Portland. I feel I want to take one approach. Talking to the people in the conference, I want to take another approach. And I probably have settled on something which is satisfactory in neither area. But nevertheless, I never begin any presentation in a public setting without recognizing there are others who have gone before who have made our path easier. And I try to dedicate my remarks always to people who have influenced me and made my life possible. However, because of the nature of this conference and the nature of this program and recent developments, I'd like to call to your memory and dedicate my remarks this afternoon to two people I never met, but for whom I have profound respect and admiration. One is the late Amy Beale, who just gave her life for the work in South Africa, and then the late Congressman Mickey Leland, who lost his life while traveling through Africa in support of children. The models that these people represent and give to us, it seems to me, make it important that we continue to keep alive their memory, not only through our words, but through our actions on behalf of children. I'd like to begin this afternoon by laying out for you my own philosophy of education, which structures everything I do and which will structure my approach to this presentation this afternoon. My philosophy of education is very simple. And not only is it simple, it is absolutely perfect. You cannot prove it wrong, and I challenge you to do so. My philosophy of education holds that there is no known limit to the capacity of the human mind to learn, grow, develop, and change. There is no known limit to the capacity of the human mind to learn, grow, develop, and change. There is no racial limit, ethnic limit, gender limit, biological limit, or any other kind of limit. And it is important in my judgment, as we begin to approach the question of reclaiming our children, that we start with the assumption that every child can learn. Every child can learn to the maximum of their ability, and the only reason children do not learn to the maximum of their ability is because they run into obstacles and roadblocks which have been put there by others and which preclude their getting this opportunity. I came to this philosophy of learning as a result of my experience both in the community and in the university. I had the privilege at the University of California of building a college from the ground up. Starting in 1968 at the University of California at Santa Cruz, 4 of us sat down to design a college which was to open in 1972. We worked together very closely designing the academic program. Then working with the architects, we designed the buildings. And while the buildings were under construction, we recruited the faculty and the students who ultimately attended that college. And like I say, 2 former students are here in the audience today. We built a college which was based on the philosophy of a profound sense of human respect and extraordinarily high expectations of students and access to anyone who was committed to learning. Ultimately, of our 600 students, approximately 48% of them were what some people would call minority, a term I eschew because it has so many negative implications that I have difficulty using it and continuing to promote those kinds of ideas. We had 48% of what some people call minority, most of them Latinos and African Americans and American Indians. However, given that background, we focus our attention on the study of the sciences. And fully half of our Black and Latino students majored successfully in chemistry, biology, math, computer science, and economics. Successfully. Not only did they do that, they did that from modest backgrounds. Young people who could not do long division when they entered the college graduated well enough to go on to professional schools across the country. 2 of them graduated from Harvard Medical School, 1 from Stanford and 1 from UCLA Medical Schools. They now have a clinic in East Los Angeles. We found that the issue for student learning was not where they were when they came in, but the kind of faculty and the kind of commitment in the institution, an institution that was unequivocally committed to a research agenda. But the faculty was committed to those students learning, and they learned more successfully than anybody believed they could. While I was building the college, I spent my evenings often and most of my weekends running the streets of Oakland, living and working with the leadership of the Black Panther Party. And ultimately, I wrote the autobiography of its founder, Huey P. Newton, a book called Revolutionary Suicide. What struck me while working with the Panther was the extraordinary similarity between the young people in that organization and the students in my college. They were full of life, they were full of hope, but the young people in the Panther had not had the opportunity my students in the college had. And as a result, they turned to a pattern of life that was pathological, some would say. But to them, it was the rational response of rational people to irrational conditions. My mind still is seared by the memory very often of evenings of sitting around the headquarters in Peralta Street in Oakland, particularly on a Monday evening when we used to enjoy Monday night football. That was a lot of fun because the exchanges that would go on as we watched this football game were just extraordinary. But as the football game was ending and the night was setting, these same young people full of life would go to closets and strap .357 Magnums to their waist. They'd take 9mm pistols and lay them around the tables next to their beds, and they'd line the walls with shotguns, never expecting that they would see the light of another day. I remember watching this scene with incredulity one evening, and one Panther tried to help me understand it by saying, "Doctor," he says, "most people decorate their walls with vases of flowers." And he picked up a big shotgun and brandished it and said, "We decorate our walls with the revolutionary tool." Now, ladies and gentlemen, working during the day to build opportunity and hope for young people and spending the weekends watching hopeless young people turn in another direction left me with the conviction that we must do more to provide access and opportunity within a context of excellence, which allows our youth, regardless of background, to develop their minds to their maximum capacity. And so I put forth for you my philosophy of education and learning. And I would challenge you, those of you in the City Club, and those of you in community organizations, to come together in such a way that regardless of where you are, what you're doing, young people get the opportunity to develop their minds. I've been in too many situations where I see corporate leaders and city leaders who can use more rhetoric and more jargon and more just plain stupidity to frustrate people in the communities. And I've been in too many situations where people in the communities have ideas and have access, but continue to run into obstacles. We don't have to do it. We're not doing it in Indianapolis. You don't have to do it in Portland. I consider this issue to be an issue of national policy because of the changes we're seeing going on around us in the society. We have reached the point of a 21st century, and we are still operating in many respects with 19th century perspectives. What do you mean when I say we've reached the point of a 21st century? The recent changes we have seen around us are going to impact this nation and this world well into the 21st century. So we don't have to wait for the chronological time for the 21st century to arrive. It is here. The demographic changes going on in this nation are happening even more rapidly than we thought they would. Just 5 or 6 years ago, the American Council on Education in its projections was claiming we would reach the point where there would be 1 out of 3, every 3 Americans would be minority by about the year 2010 to 2020. It is now clear we're going to reach that point by about the year 2000, given what we've seen in the 1990 census. We are looking at a changing technology which makes the previous approaches to our economy no longer salient. The 21st century is going to be a century in which the mind is the major tool for building new economic perspectives and new approaches. It's no longer the time when we can use our hands and manufacturing as the approach. We are going to have to develop a new approach. Frank Newman, the president of the Education Commission of the States, has written a wonderful book called Higher Education and the National Agenda, in which he lays out the expectation that the capacity of the mind and our ability to creatively use the mind makes it very, very different for us in the future than it was in the past. At the same time, we are looking at worldwide changes which absolutely were unpredictable 5 years ago and very often befuddle us. I'd like to take my students sometimes through the New Year's Eve situation in this world over the last 5 or 6 years. And you can begin to see the dramatic changes as we see the crumbling of the Soviet hegemony in Eastern Europe, the rise of a democratic regime, or the hope for a democratic regime, in South Africa, the now almost realistic hope that there might be peace in the Middle East. And so many of the barriers we thought to a new future are coming down, only to reveal that many of the ways in which we dislike each other and divide ourselves from each other that have been historically a part of our societies are coming back. So the Soviet hegemony crumbles, and we find the rise of anti-Semitism, the rise of ethnic conflict that is absolutely, absolutely unacceptable if we're talking about a 21st century which is better than the present century. But coming back to this nation, my mind has been very much challenged by a recent study that's come out of the RAND Corporation, which shows that over the last 20 years, as we have seen the nation change to a higher and higher proportion of its citizenry, minorities, or so-called minorities, we have also seen a real and substantive gap, widening gap between income and wages, between those who are at the lower end of the income scale and those who are at the upper end of the income scale. A scholar by the name of Lynn Caroli at the RAND Corporation began to extrapolate this material from the data over the last 20 years, getting away from rhetoric, getting away from politics, getting away from slogans, and looking fundamentally at what is happening in this country. And we see a widening gap between income and real wages over the last 20 years that raises serious questions about the developments that are going on in this society. We as a nation cannot become or continue to be the leaders in an international society which is breaking up in some negative ways, and at the same time have internally this situation where we are bifurcating economically and in many respects socially, because the hard reality is we cannot separate ourselves from each other. And one of the things I like about reading about the program of this conference, it seems to me it begins to approach the necessity of all groups, people from all backgrounds coming together to creatively approach these questions. The educational issues are profoundly difficult and very challenging. The American Council on Education, in its annual studies of minorities in education, argues that there has been no change in high school completion rates by and large in this country since 1976. We are at an almost flat level in terms of the improvement of high school completion rates. And the state higher education executive officers recently released a report authored by Esther Rodriguez and Michael Nettles, which shows that we can and we know how to improve the educational levels of students regardless of background. For example, the SAT and the ACT, those standardized tests, are not the barriers some people would like to believe and like to even promote. And students who take academic courses in high school, college prep courses, are continuing to improve on the SAT and the ACT. Those are not barriers. Even more significant in their report and other research, we know that students who take advanced mathematics, geometry and beyond in high school and succeed in those courses do as well in college as students from any background. It appears that geometry and advanced mathematics are the gatekeepers to success in higher education. Those courses tend to wipe out income differences, racial and ethnic differences, and gender differences in college performance. So it's this high school preparation issue that we need to focus on if we want to talk about improving the situation in terms of higher education. But in terms of high school preparation, we are seeing high school completion, we are seeing some very troubling trends when we look beyond the gross data. For Anglo students, there appears to be a level of completion at high school. For so-called minority students, particularly African Americans and Latinos, the data indicate that it's been an improvement for African Americans, but it's tending to go down a little bit in the last year or two, and the major reason is because of a widening gender difference. African American women educationally are continuing to excel over African American men. And that is an important issue that I want to come back to in a moment. To add to that, we see a similar pattern among Latino or Hispanic students at the high school completion level. Hispanic completion rates are below those of African Americans and below those of Anglos. But in the more recent data, it appears that Latino women are, like the black women, continuing to improve while Latino men are beginning to withdraw. To add to that, the data from the American Council on Education shows that as significant as the differences between the racial and ethnic groups are the differences in high school completion between the economic groups. Even though white students may complete high school at higher levels than black students, in point of fact, when you control for income, the big gap is between poor students and those who are more able because of affluence. Anglo students who are in the lower income brackets are as far from Anglo students in the upper income brackets in terms of high school completion as are black students and Latino students. And the data indicate that in addition to issues of race and ethnicity in this country, we have some very serious issues of income and class. And we cannot ignore it. We simply cannot ignore it. When poor people aren't doing well, it doesn't matter whether they are white, black, Hispanic, Native American, or otherwise. Their poverty appears to be almost like a prison. And not only is it a prison, it is a prison, social prison, which is increasing in number. I would like to make reference briefly to that famous, or the very fine study by the W.T. Grant Commission of a few years ago, which looked at these data in terms of those students who actually finish high school. And what the W.T. Grant Commission learned was that even when they finish high school, if they don't go on to further education and training, the prospects for economic prosperity are not good. In a very fine study of young people between 18 to 24 who had completed high school and entered the labor force, the W.T. Grant Commission study found that those students, after 10 years, were doing worse than high school graduates of the previous era. Why? Because they had reached a top level of skills which did not allow them to take advantage of the changing technology and the changing economic picture. My point, ladies and gentlemen, my point is we are faced with a major paradigm shift, in my opinion, in which I would argue that those who are males are tending, and those who are poor are tending to not participate. They are tending to not share in the benefits of this nation. And not only do they not share, they find that even when they buy into the rhetoric of the high school diploma and the job, that the economy is changing so rapidly, they are being left behind. And in many, many respects, it is not simply a racial or ethnic matter. It's a class matter. And we are challenged with trying to figure out what we might do to begin to approach this. And this is particularly true for African American males and Latino males. The sad thing is, we know all that we need to know in order to reclaim our children. We know how to do it, and we know what to do. But we lack, in my opinion, the will and the commitment to do it. We need no more studies. We need no more commissions. We need the kind of commitment and vision and leadership that will bring people like the City Club together with people like the agencies represented here to provide the opportunity for people to begin to deal with their challenges. Let me then turn to my last major point that I want to make this morning, and that is the whole issue of access, diversity, and creativity as providing one approach to this issue. When we built the college in California, we built it based on the notion that high expectations within a context of broad support for the students' goals would lead to outstanding outcomes, and the evidence shows that to be the case. Our college had the lowest level of retention and graduation after 4 years at the University of California, and the highest after 6 years. We had the highest rate of acceptance into graduate and professional schools, and the highest rate of success of our students in those schools subsequently. We found people coming to us seeking our students because they didn't have to play catch-up. The first major issue was to provide access and opportunity. We did not spend a lot of time trying to put up barriers of grades or standardized test scores. Instead, we sought those who were committed and who wanted to learn, and we put them together with faculty who were ready to teach them in a context of high expectations and support. Young people know when they've been had by social systems. They know when they haven't been taught. And when they came to our college and we promised to teach them, we did not offer them an easy path. But what we said was, if you commit to this, we can offer you a positive consequence. But if you don't commit to it, there's nothing we can do for you. Secondly, we found the diversity among our students to be one of the most extraordinary dynamics of that situation. First of all, people could look at each other and begin to see, I'm not the only one in this boat, or I'm not the only one in this situation, or there are other ways to begin to deal with my situation. Recently, Steve Weiner, the head of the Western Association of Schools and Colleges, did a study of minorities in colleges in California, and he argued that one of the most positive consequences of that situation, one of the things that worked very positively, was when people from different ethnic and racial groups existed in the same environment. It wasn't all A and B, but it was the diversity that led to a new dynamic. Troy Duster, in his research at the University of California at Berkeley, is finding the same kind of dynamic, that students who come from a multiplicity of backgrounds, when they are in a creative and positive context, begin to approach the dynamics and the situation very differently from the way anybody would have predicted. It's not being black or white or Latino and this, that, and the other. It's being everything that one wants to be when one wants to be it. I'll never forget one of my students at the University of California, Santa Cruz, by the name of Jose Orozco, who came to realize in that environment he could be anything he wanted to be. And he chose to be everything he wanted to be depending upon the day of the week. One day he was a Chicano, one day he was a Mexican American, one day he was a Mexican, and most times he was just Jose. But he found nobody stopped him from being what he wanted to be, but we challenged him to be much more than anybody ever thought he could be. The access issue combined with the diversity issue led to a quality of creativity we would have never predicted. Never predicted. Our students not only began to deal with their circumstances and their situations, they began to develop new ideas we would have never known. Our most successful course was a course in tragedy, Greek tragedy, Shakespearean tragedy, and modern tragedy. And it was successful because the teacher and the students came together and began to find themselves in that literature in such a way that they understood their own dynamics and could then reach beyond where they were. The creativity from the students was one of the most exciting things one could ever see. And it was creative because we put no limits on our expectations, we put no limits on our opportunities, and we put no barriers to their trying to improve. Instead, the only limit we would put was if you do not meet our expectations, we will not give you a degree. And they met our expectations and they got those degrees. It became a situation of high expectations and profound support for their innovation and their creativity. But it also became a situation in which we moved from a deficit model to an asset model. And that's the last point I want to make this morning in beginning to argue this. What is the deficit model as compared to the asset model? Think about it. Think about the descriptors you know your friends use when they talk about students that we're talking about in this conference. The general term now is students at risk. Now, if you ask at risk of what? We're all at risk. You walk out that door and get in your car, you're at risk. But we don't consider ourselves at risk. But if a student walks in and they have one parent in the home, and they have a certain income level, and they have certain other characteristics, we say they're at risk, don't we? And essentially, the whole conceptualization is one of a series of deficits, what those students lack. Or when we use the term minority students, or students with high need, or high potential, or whatever, the tendency is to utilize concepts which are fundamentally based on a notion of lack of ability or performance. Even the term that they probably use here for many of our commuting students, non-traditional. Who wants to be known as a non-anything? But we use that all of the time. And what I'm trying to say is, in our very terminology and our conceptualization of the other, we shape a non-person, and we communicate it in subtle but definite ways, and young people pick it up. But if you begin to reflect on the assets they bring, you see a different kind of a thing when you begin to build on those assets. Look at a mother who has children, who has no spouse, and who is focused on welfare. And you very often find one of the most determined people you'd ever want to meet. One who doesn't want to see her children take the other path. Now, you can look at that as a family at risk, or you can look at that as a family with determination. And if you look at it as a family with determination and expectations of excellence and achievement for their children, you will take a very different approach. And what I want to argue is that to a great degree, our refusal to look at our own assumptions, our own values, and our own perceptions of the other is often what stands in the way, which is the reason why I get so upset with organizations and clubs, and I'm not trying to be critical of the Portland Club. I don't know anything about you, but I know enough about other places to know that people are interested but not committed. And their lack of commitment comes out in the way in which they conceptualize these issues. Let me then end by saying that in my university, we have taken the asset approach. And we began not to look for the problems, but to look for the strengths. And in our approach to building partnerships and collaboration with the community, we began to ask ourselves, who are the people who have the assets, the determination, the perseverance, and the commitment, and how can we help them do a better job? We weren't talking about a commitment of money or of financial resources, but a commitment of human resources, facilities, and support which allowed us to build in that way. And we have found that we had to develop a complex variety of programs, all of which have had extraordinary success. In some cases, we worked directly with the superintendent of schools, because in one community, the superintendent of schools and the mayor have made this their commitment, and the university became the third part of this partnership. So we have the schools, the community, and the university working together, and we are impacting that community in very profound ways. And it's the easiest way because the schools have the children all the time. And the superintendent of schools makes sure that the principals who report to him and the teachers who report to that principal understand which direction we're going. And the mayor, through his involvement, has gotten parents and the community involved. And it becomes a holistic approach. But we didn't develop a program, we just began to build on the strengths we found. In another situation, we went strictly with the high school principal, because the principal was providing the leadership. And that principal has gotten parents involved in such a way that the school, which in Indianapolis had the lowest rate of graduation 7 years ago, now has the highest. And it's because we work with the principal and the person who is committed. There's a lot of good things going in the schools. A lot of good things going in the schools here. And if you look creatively and find those people and support them, encourage them, they'll do even more, and they'll do more than you could not predict. What has been very exciting to me is the way in which we have worked with churches in the community. With the Hispanic Holistic Education Center run by a Catholic church in the inner city, we've been able to develop very close partnerships to build and offer opportunity for Latino students. And then through another coalition of 8 inner city churches. We didn't go with the big churches, the ministers everybody knows. We went with the people who were out on the block doing the job with education. You have the capacity within you and within this community to reclaim every child. And there is no reason why any child who reaches the age where they can go to school should be a failure. And if they are, it ought to be considered our failure. If we challenge everyone who is committed in the way that we consider important to provide high expectations within a context of respect, we can not only reclaim our children, Portland could be the leader for other cities in how a community, an entire community, can come together and reclaim its children. We intend to make Indianapolis a national model, but we're far from perfect, and we wouldn't mind having a little competition from you. But I don't think you'll catch us, and that's too bad, but we're glad to work with you as you continue to try. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Blake. We have about 15 minutes for questions, and we're going to start with Pete Heuser, and then Nancy Stanley, and then we open to questions from the audience. Pete?
Thank you, Dr. Blake. We appreciate, I think, all that you've done over the years to encourage community support for primary and secondary schools. I know that over the last 10 or 20 years that there have been some programs on the federal and state level to perhaps level the playing field so that all the kids have an equal chance. I don't know if you're aware, but in Oregon a couple of years ago there was a property tax limitation passed, and it's now being implemented, so we've all seen some cutbacks in the schools. One of the responses which communities have had to this is to try to support their local schools. I know recently we saw an example of a local school in a fairly affluent area being able to build a nice new track for their around their football field. But perhaps one of the problems this raises is that this might tend to renew the inequities that we've seen in the past, differences in ability to fund their schools. Do you think that community involvement in that way presents a danger to renew the inequities of the past?
I think that when people are in situations where they have an opportunity to do more for their children, they're going to do it. And they ought to be respected for doing it. I don't hold it against people who have opportunity to build those kinds of situations to do that. But the inequity, I won't use the term inequity. I find that somewhat, if you don't mind, emotion laden. There is not the same balance between that community and some of the inner city communities. I would not say to the community that has the opportunity to build tracks and provide resources for its students to not do it. What I do say is for those who have the commitment to working with other communities, they ought to do their task too. We have in my community a whole group of business leaders who have come together, calling themselves Community Leaders Allied to Support Schools, or CLASS. And they provide resources to the people who are doing creative jobs in the inner cities. And it's not a question, I'm not opposed to the notion of balancing out the tax situation as they're trying to do in Michigan and other places. What I am opposed to is trying to say if you have privilege and opportunity, you shouldn't take advantage of it, because people are. And what I am arguing is that those of you seated here who have a chance to do a job, think seriously about those who are doing it. As I talked with people this morning, I ran into a number of people who have very, very creative ideas. And what is needed more and more are people who will back them. And I'm not talking necessarily about financial backing, even though that is critical and important. Sometimes a person who will visit with a principal or a teacher and provide a mentorship to the principal and to the teacher helps that person to gather their resources for another day. It's hard for me to stand here and lay out individual programs, but I would say that if the leaders of the Portland City Club were to begin to, quote, hang out, and I use that term deliberately, and listen eloquently, which is even more important, the Langston Hughes term, listen eloquently, you would find probably innumerable situations in this city where good things are happening, and develop systematic strategies to make them happen better. And rather than say, don't build that tract, provide opportunities here. And as these opportunities begin to develop, people who are engaged will think creatively about how the other things are doing. But I cast no stones and no aspersions at anyone who has opportunity and takes advantage of it, because that's what made us what we are.
Good afternoon, Dr. Blake. I'm Nancy Stanley with the City Club's Education Committee. While I sense you're a little reluctant to focus on certain programs, certain kinds of creative activities that can be done, We would be interested in knowing if perhaps you have a favorite, one or two types of collaborations that you have seen be very successful in terms of providing access and opportunity to young children.
My reluctance to speak specifically is because I believe there is no clear roadmap, number one, and certainly there's no simple formula. That's number one. Number two, my reluctance is because I was trained as a community organizer by Miles Horton and Septima Clark. And their particular approach structures what I do, and I won't go into detail about it. But if I were to say I had a favorite approach, it would be an approach which strengthened the schools itself. The children are in the schools, and if there are ways we can improve the situation in the schools, I would do it. What I would do and what I find works in the school situation I'm talking about, Beech Grove City Schools, is to develop the strategies which reduces the extraordinary demands on teachers in terms of the conditions of teaching. The classroom size, the engagement that it takes to make it through the day, and all of the other kinds of things that we put on teachers. Sometimes the conditions of work are extremely difficult. But if I had a preference, it would be to take advantage of that situation and begin to build it from there. When we did it with the high school, Arlington High School, we found the principal went out and engaged the parents. And as she engaged the parents themselves became more creative. But we could not develop a program for the parents. The principal did. And as the parents became empowered, they did something one would have never predicted. They started a thing, you may have seen it on TV, called Security Dads, where they just walk around, the fathers, one in wheelchair, and the kids who might act out when somebody else is around won't act out because that's your daddy over there. And these fathers, but my point is, you can't from a position in some central administration say, we'll start program A. I was showing my sister last night at her home. She was so nice to pick me up at the airport and give me a place to sleep. A video we did, and I'll be very specific, in a church, where we began to teach church leaders how to use hands-on approaches to science to teach children science. Then this minister got inspired and turned his whole religious service into a science education service. And so we made a videotape of him teaching kids how to be cool in school by taking a battery and putting it together with tin foil to make a fan and learning the scientific principles, knowing and tying that to religion. My point, ma'am, is you cannot predict the creativity, the brilliance in the community. But you can provide the opportunity. My last example, Septima Clark taught me. A lot of us got our start in this effort because of the extraordinary model of Rosa Parks. Remember Rosa Parks? Always remember Rosa Parks was a seamstress. She didn't have any high degree of training or education. She had a commitment. And there were people who helped her to realize she had the power to make a change. And I believe out there are millions of people like this, but they find nobody who talks to them and listens to them. And I will bet you if I had 2 or 3 of the people that work with me who stayed in this community for 6 months, they would bring you 100 examples. But you have your own people and you can find them. But if I had a favorite, it would be to strengthen where the children already are, and they're in the schools, and then to add that the community agencies is a way of building the village.
My name's Dave Olson. I'm a member of the City Club. When it comes to creativity, I think one of the most powerful areas you can apply it, particularly for minorities, is in the field of going into business for yourself. I'll bet Rosa Parks was an independent business person as a seamstress. And I could give you countless examples of people that couldn't get jobs that went out and created their own jobs.
I think that you have put your finger on a very critical issue. I was brought in to talk about education, and I did. 2 weeks ago at the Morehouse Research Institute at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, 15 of us sat down to talk about developing that research institute which focuses on black males. And indeed, some of the most impressive presentations we had were on entrepreneurship and on entrepreneurship at the grassroots level. And I would have to agree with you 100%, that this is a very critical area. As John Sibley Butler, who is a professor of sociology at University of Texas, said, listen, he was opposed to these English as a second language. He says, all of the immigrants in my town who are doing so well only know two things, $2.95 and thank you. And he says, and their kids go to college. And he is doing a marvelous study of black entrepreneurship in Durham, North Carolina. And the evidence seems to indicate that this was an avenue of upward mobility for a long time and still is an avenue of upward mobility. And if we look at the changing economic picture in which job growth is in small firms, not in the large multinational firms we've known, there clearly is an area of great opportunity here that we have yet to understand, and I think you are absolutely correct.
Thank you.
I thought that was someone moving to the podium. I think I will take advantage of the time, though, to thank the Black United Fund for allowing us to grace the podium with Dr. Blake. It's an honor to have you have this conference here, and we've enjoyed having him. And I'd like to say thank you to Dr. Blake for raising our expectations for what we can do for our children. So perhaps we should give Dr. Blake and the Black United Fund our applause and thanks, and we will adjourn.